And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist John Cowen with your Alaska Aviation Weather Forecast. We'll start out looking at flying weather across the state for Wednesday morning. As you can see, we have plenty of IFR across the southern portions of the state, mainly across the southeastern Bering Coast, into the Alaska Range, as well as the Chugach, and most of the higher terrain that extends along the coast all the way into the northern Panhandle, as we have generally unsettled weather across this region, but the main feature will be a strong low pressure center over the southeastern Bering that'll be driving most of the weather. We have IFR conditions as well across portions of the eastern Brooks Range, as well as getting into the North Slope. Taking a look at Wednesday afternoon, we do see some improvement as our low pressure center over the Bristol Bay area generally weekends into Wednesday afternoon. Still some lingering IFR over portions of southwestern Alaska. Plenty of IFR as well across much of the immediate coast of the northern Gulf of Alaska into the northern Panhandle, especially the higher terrain there along the border, and still some lingering marginal and IFR conditions across the Brooks Range. Getting into Thursday morning, plenty of IFR still along the west coast of Alaska, extending all the way from the Bering Strait all the way into the Bristol Bay area. Again, some of the higher elevations, especially the Alaska Range, getting into the Alaska Peninsula. Some IFR there as we have another storm system that'll be moving up from the North Pacific into the Gulf of Alaska, bringing some IFR conditions to much of this region. Still some lingering IFR again across the western Brooks Range. This time marginal conditions extend along much of the North Slope. And then getting into the Panhandle, we do have IFR conditions over most of the southern Panhandle with marginal conditions over much of the rest of the area. And then finally for Thursday afternoon, IFR conditions again extend across much of the Panhandle and Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island as well as the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Alaska, or rather western Alaska Range. Conditions starting to clear out across much of the interior. Pretty decent flying weather for Thursday afternoon with some IFR again lingering along much of the west coast. Let's take a look at our passes. Anaktuvik Pass for Wednesday, starting out marginal VFR, improving to VFR throughout the day. However, on the north side of the passes, we do expect to keep MVFR conditions. Same story for Adigan Pass, starting out the day at MVFR, improving to VFR with those marginal conditions on the north side of the pass. Coming down to the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill Passes, both IFR all day. Same story for Rainy Pass. Same story for Windy Pass, and then getting over to Isabel, we do expect conditions to improve as we look eastward. MVFR conditions for Isabel Pass on Wednesday, and Mentasta Pass staying in VFR weather. Coming down to Tanita Pass, we expect marginal conditions for most of the day Wednesday. Portage Pass starting out the day in IFR and improving to marginal conditions in the afternoon. And then looking over towards the Alaska Panhandle, Chilkoot and White Passes starting out the day in IFR, improving to marginal conditions later on in the afternoon. Let's take a look at our freezing levels. So most of the state seeing freezing levels down to the surface as we might expect for this time of year. However, portions of southwestern Alaska, the Alaska Peninsula, freezing levels between the surface and 2,000 feet, an area of higher freezing levels here just north of the Alaska Range as well. And as we look towards the Panhandle, freezing levels increase rather quickly up towards 8,000 feet over the southern portions of the Panhandle. Now, as you might expect, we have some areas of icing with these storm systems that'll be moving into our area. Over the Panhandle, we're looking generally above 4,000 feet for those moderate icing conditions on Wednesday. However, as we get towards the southern portions of the Panhandle, those will increase rather rapidly above 8,000. Coming over to South Central, some areas of considerable moderate IFR, or rather icing across much of the coast. These are going to be above 2,000 feet. Again, above 2,000 feet over the Bering Coast, and then getting up into the Brooks Range, some isolated areas of icing, generally from the surface up to about 8,000 feet. Let's take a look at our jet streams. So we have some stronger winds along the immediate Gulf Coast. 105 knots is what we're looking at in this area. We do have a stronger jet over the central Panhandle, 140 knots in this area, generally out of the southwest. And then as we come over towards the Aleutians, over the far western Aleutians, generally staying out of the strongest winds, about 50 knots or so over this area, but the stronger winds are going to be well to the south of the chain. Coming down to 9,000 feet, those winds are not quite as strong as we might expect over the Aleutians. About 40 knots is what we're looking at over the far western Aleutians, 30 knots over the central Aleutians, generally out of the north there. Some winds around 30 to 40 knots across much of the southern half of mainland Alaska, generally going to be out of the south in this area. And then over the Panhandle, we have the stronger winds that are going to be over the southern portions of the Panhandle, looking at about 40 to 50 knots across this area. And then finally coming down to 3,000 feet, those stronger winds are going to be displaced south of the Panhandle, so really not all that strong at the surface anyway. Looking up north across the Arctic slope, 55 knots over Barter Island. So we do have some fairly strong low-level winds in the Kaktovik to Utqiagvik area. So some issues potentially with some turbulence there as well. And then over the central and western Aleutians, generally winds out of the north to northwest around 40 knots or so. And then, as you might expect, our areas of turbulence. We do have an area of possible severe turbulence coming over Kodiak. This is going to be late in the day Wednesday, as we have a core of stronger winds that'll be moving across this area. Surface to about 5,000 feet is what we're looking at for that. Generally across the Aleutians, we're looking at surface to about 4,000 feet for some occasional moderate turbulence. And then surface up to about 8,000 feet, as we do have some stronger winds that'll be moving across the higher terrain of the Alaska Range, so do expect those higher areas of turbulence. And then across the west coast, generally the western Brooks Range into St. Lawrence Island, generally surface to about 4,000 feet for that moderate turbulence. And that'll wrap up our aviation forecast. I'm meteorologist John Cowen.